As you've undoubtedly heard, Zelda 2 Adventures of Link is often referred to as the black sheep of the franchise. Personally, I always gave that title to Phantom Hourglass since no one actually talks about that game, but maybe that's less to do with infamy and more to do with being forgettable. Either way, I'm actually looking forward to trying it out, but there's still quite some time left before that. Back on topic, Zelda 2 graced the NES in the States all the way back in late 1988, and from what I can find had decently good reception and actually received praise from critics. It's odd considering its current infamy, but maybe it's just a case of changing standards and some games just not aging well. At least that's what I just assumed, but people still have fun with the original game, myself included, despite that not aging so gracefully. Maybe these are just arguments I made up in my head since my first time playing didn't go so well. I got the game on the Virtual Console back when Nintendo kind of cared about their customers, played about an hour of it, then went right back to Wind Waker HD. That's basically all my experience with the game. Couple that with its huge differences in gameplay style, and I just never looked back. Now, however, I'm on a mission, and Zelda 2 is just another hurdle that must be crossed to reach my goal. How big of a hurdle is it? I'm going to tell you, as these are my opinions on Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Before I talk about the story proper, there's something I need to make abundantly clear beforehand, and that's about the Zelda franchise's timeline as a whole. I am well aware there exists a canon between games. Just like you, I've read through the Hyrule Historia. It is a fun read, but to me it is nothing more than that. I do not care about the overarching canon between titles unless the plot directly ties into the next, like what we have here with Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. I see Zelda games in the same vein as I see Final Fantasy titles, where they often share common elements such as themes and iconography, but that's it. Personally, I feel like the Zelda games do a good enough job with their respective stories that I don't feel like I'm left questioning events or beats that will only make sense if I play the other game. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, with few exceptions, you do not need to play these games in chronological order to understand what's going on. If you play Majora's Mask without playing Ocarina of Time, you won't be confused in the slightest. Is Wind Waker the only Zelda game you've ever played? That's okay. Nothing story-wise will be more clarified by having the knowledge from previous titles. If a Zelda game looks fun to you, just pick it up and start playing. Frankly, you can even do that with Zelda 2 because it has all the complexity of a potato. Now that that's out of the way, I'm going to discuss the game's actual story. Just like the first game, if you wait around on the start screen for long enough, you'll get the game's plot. After Ganon explodes into a fine mist, Zelda gets put under the effects of a sleeping spell. It isn't explained how, but she won't wake back up unless we use the power of No 3 Triforce sealed away in a palace in Hyrule. In order to get into this palace, there are 6 other palaces which are used to break a seal that has been placed to prevent evil from getting inside. Once again, it's a simple rescue the princess and save the land story, but with more of a coming-of-age feel to it. It's simple, it works, but it could be better. That is where the manual comes in. I can't believe I forgot to talk about the previous game's manual, and I honestly blame modern gaming's lack of them. Game manuals themselves will be another topic for another video, but the point I'm making here is Zelda 2's manual has a much more fleshed out story than what we get here on the title screen. It's the same idea, Zelda gets put to sleep, go save her, but it has more detail packed into it. Many seasons have passed since the first game, and it turns out defeating Ganon didn't actually save the day. Many of his minions still roam the lands, causing chaos and destruction, waiting for his return. It turns out, Link is just the unluckiest man alive, as sprinkling his blood on Ganon's ashes is the key to reviving the Dark Lord, for you see, Link isn't just some average Joe Schmo who can wildly stab at invisible pig monsters, but he is indeed chosen by the powers that be. Approaching his 16th birthday, making Link barely a teenager, a strange mark appeared on the back of his hand. This mark is the royal family crest, or the Triforce. It turns out the previous king of Hyrule long ago died at a young age, having everything passed on to Zelda's brother, the prince. Neither of these two have official names, by the way. Something was amiss, however, as the prince realized that he only inherited 2 of the 3 pieces of the Triforce. He searched and searched for the missing part, but ultimately came up empty. That is, until a magician, still no name, who was close to the king, told him that the only person the king entrusted the knowledge of its whereabouts to was none other than Princess Zelda herself. Outraged, and I can't stress enough how outraged he was since he's seen an official artwork threatening the princess with a whip, He begins to question her, but she refuses to give up the secret. Since the magician is very clearly evil, he grows impatient and begins to cast a spell that puts Zelda to sleep. The prince realizes he's made a huge mistake and attempts to stop the magician, but ultimately fails. He strikes down the magician just a hair too late as the spell is cast and Zelda is thrown into eternal slumber. Zelda's nursemaid Impa, who's the one that tells Link this story, retrieves a small box containing 6 crystals and a scroll and hands them to Link. The scroll is written in an ancient script that no one can read anymore, but being the one chosen by the Triforce, Link finds out he actually can read it. The scroll was written by the late king, explaining that if the 3 pieces of the Triforce come together, they can achieve their ultimate power. What sort of power is this? Plot. The power is plot. The note then goes on to talk about how he has hidden it in the Great Palace in the Valley of Death. In order to get into the palace, 6 stones must be placed in the altars scattered within 6 other palaces around Hyrule. These palaces are treacherous though, filled with guardians created by the king in order to prevent enemies from invading them. Armed with nothing but his trusty sword and shield, Link sets out to retrieve the Triforce of Courage and once again save the princess and attempt to restore Hyrule to its former glory. This is a much better story. I understand that early NES games weren't exactly known for in-depth story, and a lot of that was due to limitations, but the difference is night and day. It's the same story, but it's fleshed out just enough to present a better call to arms. It also explains a couple extra details within the game that I actually wasn't aware of before. It gives context to the defeat screen, which states, "Return of Ganon." It makes enough sense, the hero dies, and the land is incapable of stopping evil. But with the additional story the manual provides, not only do I now understand that his minions are trying to resurrect him, but that his blood is needed for that to happen. There's also an actual explanation as to why the overworld monsters don't appear in the palaces and vice versa, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. This is still an NES game though. Whether you read the manual or just the title screen, the actual plot stops there until you reach the final scene before the credits. The addition of the threat of Ganon's revival through some blood ritual does add extra sense of danger, which is very welcoming. Overall, just like the first game, it serves its ultimate purpose, which is to provide you with a reason to go out there and save the day. The first game was a huge success. Everyone loved its sprawling overworld where you're free to roam in any direction you like. When it comes to video games, a sequel's job is to do 2 things. The first is to expand upon the world within, the second is to improve on the gameplay. Zelda 2 did the former in the game's manual, and the latter by changing about 95% of how the game plays. There's still a big, sprawling overworld to traverse, but the real meat here is the completely different 2D sections of gameplay shown to you right within the first screen. This is a major source of discourse among Zelda fans and what gets the most attention when referred to as the aforementioned black sheep. I will admit, this was the entire reason why I didn't care for the game myself. It was already hard enough playing this game after having played future installments, but now we've got something radically different. It just didn't mesh with me. Like I said, I'm on a mission now and this game will not defeat me. Let's get the overworld gameplay out of the way first, as it's the only part that's similar to the first game. All you need to worry about here is moving Link around to get yourself from point A to point B. Hyrule has undergone a massive facelift, however, as it looks nothing like the original. I believe this is for the better though, as there are now several more landmarks that make getting your bearings a bit easier. That, and you are no longer restricted to screens, so you won't have to watch a transition every few seconds, making navigation leagues better than the first. You will come across some of the same landmarks such as Death Mountain or the Graveyard. There are even towns this time, giving some much needed life to the world. That's where the similarities end, as the rest of the game is played in the new 2D style. Whether you're fighting monsters with the game's new random encounter system, traversing through caves or palaces, or even visiting a town, you'll control Link in a 2D side-scrolling environment. Link has limbered up a bit since the previous game, as I feel like he controls much smoother. Not quite the buttery smooth you'd expect from other 2D games, but this is a marked improvement over how stiff he felt before. Although it appears Link has decided that his sword from the previous title was a little too heavy, as I swear this one is way too short. It feels like I've traded a long sword for a dagger. Maybe it's just the different perspective, but you gotta get right into these enemies if you want to reliably hit them. This isn't too much of an issue to be honest, but I'd still like it to be just a smidgen longer. Along with that, Link also has the ability to jump, and it feels pretty good. At full health, you get this little sword beam like the first game, but unlike the first game, this one is basically useful for early enemies only, as the tougher ones just brush it off like it's nothing. Somehow, the sound it makes is even worse than the first game. I mentioned earlier that this game relies on random encounters, but these don't work like Final Fantasy or other traditional RPGs. Instead, whenever you're traversing the overworld, shadows will spawn and bumping into them will trigger an encounter. You don't actually have to defeat the enemies, the goal is simply to get to the edge of the screen. Leaving the encounter puts you right back to where you came from, and you're free to go on your merry way. Enemies do not spawn if you're traveling on a road tile, and should you spawn them off and then engage the shadow on a road, your encounter will simply be a screen with no enemies. Towns are the other safe areas within the game. Entering a town lets you talk to actual denizens of Hyrule. Most don't really have much to say, but they aren't all useless. Towns are where you get upgrades in the form of new moves such as the up and down stab attacks and even magic spells. That's right. Along with the ability to read ancient script, Link now has the ability to cast magic and is the first game to introduce the concept. These aren't always just given to you outright. Some will require you to do a simple fetch quest, whether it's retrieving water from a well that's 15 feet away from the quest giver, or returning a child who wandered into this random maze. The usefulness of spells vary, from the incredibly useful shield and jump spells, which significantly increase defense and jump height, to the nearly pointless spells like the spell. Using spells costs magic, which have a number next to them indicate how many points they use. This is a useless metric, as your visual indicator for remaining magic power is a bar. Basically, the higher the number, the more it drains. Since I'm on the subject, let's talk about the other elephant in the room, and that's this number in the upper right of the HUD. This is the other element that divides people on this game. Zelda 2 is an action RPG. While you still find heart containers as well as magic jars that give you extra health and magic respectively, that's not the only way Link improves in this game. Defeating enemies or picking up these bags with the letter P on them gives Link experience points. Reach the number indicated and Link will level up, increasing one of 3 stats: attack, magic, and life. A bit misleading, but still easy enough to explain. Attack, as represented by this number next to the sword icon, is how much damage you do. The higher the number, the more damage you do, the faster you can kill enemies. Magic, shown by the number above your magic meter, doesn't increase the amount of magic you have, but rather decreases the cost of spells. Finally, life, shown by the number above your health bar, is an indicator for defense, and each level will make enemies deal less damage. I don't really mind this. I'm a pretty big fan of watching numbers go up, whether it be experience and character stats, or something like watching money go up in an economy-focused game. Plus, if you find an area particularly challenging, you can just grind a couple levels and you'll be in a better position to tackle anything in your way. You don't even have to spend it right away. The level up screen has a value next to each stat. Hitting the cancel button on the top lets you keep your experience until you hit the next milestone. So if you want to skip a stat for now to get the other, slightly more expensive stat, you can do that. You need to be careful doing this though. The later levels get really expensive and this game is very punishing. The one gameplay change that still baffles me is the inclusion of a life system. Like most NES games, Link now has a certain amount of lives. Lose them all, and it's game over. This does 2 things. Firstly, it resets your experience gained to 0. Only one enemy away from a level up? Start over. This wouldn't be too big of an issue, but enemies don't give you very much experience, and as stated earlier, the later levels get ridiculous with the amount required. Secondly, you are put back to Hyrule Palace regardless of where you're at in the game. I can live with experience loss, but this is an especially cruel punishment. If you get all the way to a palace's boss fight on the other side of the map, just happen to biff it right at the end, you better put on a good pair of running shoes as you now have to make your way all the way back. The guardians in the dungeon respawn as well, but thankfully these palaces have all the complexity of the first game's dungeon, but just in 2D. We're not quite done with the overworld yet though. While traveling around, you'll run across encounter spaces, which are unmarked tiles that, when stepped on, force you into an encounter. These are usually things like bridges, pits, or some tiles that have goodies like the heart containers. There are also plenty of caves, and these range in difficulty from simple to hair-pulling frustration. You'll encounter all the trappings of a 2D game like Castlevania, for example. Instant death pits, which you'll likely fall into via knockback, short corridors that limit your ability to maneuver around enemies, and tons of enemies that either hit really hard or come in clusters that are difficult to dodge. Then there's Death Mountain. Personally, I think this is thrown at you way too early. You need to navigate through several caves, each coming out of a random entrance, making it into a maze, and each being filled with Ganon's bloodthirsty minions. Death Mountain might as well be an honorary dungeon, seeing as it took me over an hour to clear this beast, and that was fairly high level from my understanding. It mostly had to do with these axe-wielding maniacs and their incredibly long range. Skill issue for sure, but I can't help but think Link isn't well equipped to handle these guys. Speaking of dungeons and palaces, I think it's time to take a look at those. Just like towns and overworld encounters, palaces are also entirely 2D. By removing just one axis out of the equation, the dungeons have become way more interesting than the first game. You still have screens, but the geometry of each screen is much more interesting even if there are still repeat rooms. There's one other key distinction between the two titles, and that's the lack of a compass or a map. It's not too bad for the first few palaces, but the later ones get pretty big and you can get lost easier than you'd expect. Purists out there might condemn me for it, but I had an image of each palace's map up at all times. It's not even the worst thing I did, but I'll save that for the end. Anyway, Palace 1. It's by far the easiest and the shortest. You've only got one true hazard, and it's this bridge that crumbles as you walk along it. Even then, the only danger is trying to grab this pea bag since you won't fall unless you stop for too long. The timing is kind of tight though. This isn't the last time you'll be goaded into something like this, so keep that in mind. Just like Zelda 1, you will still need to thoroughly traverse the palace and acquire keys to progress. Unlike the first game, you can only use keys in their respective palaces. This means no more saving unused keys, and no more buying them either. I couldn't figure out where to include this tidbit and have it make sense, but shops are gone entirely. So are rupees. One thing that Zelda 2 doesn't do though is ease you into things. The first palace may be short, but immediately throws some tough enemies at you in the form of these weird Cyclops guys that throw flails at you and act like Mario's Hammer Brothers, and Iron Knuckles. These guys are basically this game's Dark Nuts, but the side profile makes them more intimidating. They are, however, much easier to deal with. Like Link, they can adjust their shield to block high and low attacks, as well as change where they swing their sword. Trying to fight them on the ground is pretty rough, but thankfully, if you can time a jump attack well enough, you'll slip right over their shield and stab their eyes. I've heard from numerous sources that the best way is a crouch jump stab, but this never worked out for me. There are two more enemies in here that are less threatening in terms of raw damage they do to Link, but have much more obnoxious effects. The bubbles, returning from Zelda 1, and these weird things that hop around and constantly spawn from either side of the screen. The bubbles don't stop you from attacking, but instead drain your magic if you touch them. They also move like Manhandla did, i.e. VHS DVD screensaver. They have tons of HP, but also give out a whopping 50 experience per kill, making them a great way to get through the first few levels since you'll only have to kill a few of them. These things that come from the sides, apparently called Wosu, are terrible and I very much dislike them. I'll refer to enemies of this type as experience thief enemies because that's exactly what they do. They take away your experience points. Getting hit drops them by 10. All of these enemies die in one hit, but they are such a pain to deal with. Defeating a Wosu doesn't even grant you experience, so you're better off getting out of any room you find them in and not lingering. This palace's boss is Horsehead. I'm going to be up front here, there's only one boss in the entire game I actually like fighting, and it ain't him. Very simple strategy, aim for the head and avoid his mace. Horsehead has the same issue most bosses and enemies do, and that's his speed and weapons hitbox. He goes down quickly, but to do damage you have to time a jump attack and then quickly jump back out or get hit by his weapon, which cannot be blocked. Defeating him, or any boss for that matter, has a key rain from the sky so you can enter into the next room and place the stone into the statue. Keep a couple things in mind before doing this though. The first one being what happens after you place the stone. Doing so grants you a full level regardless of how much experience you need. If you need 1,000 experience, it'll give you 1,000. If you only need 3, it gives you 3, and that's it. If you're near the next level, it'd be worth it to go and grind out that last bit so you can essentially skip a level. The other thing to keep in mind is leaving a palace after beating the boss and getting the item inside will cause it to crumble and you cannot get back inside. Not that you would necessarily need to at this point. Speaking of items, the one you get in the first palace is a candle. Before you get to the palace, you need to walk through a cave, which has a dark effect like some of the rooms in the first game. I won't go on a rant about it, even though these are worse since you can't even see the enemies, because this only matters for the first one since this candle automatically lights up any cave going forward. It simply begs the question, why even bother? As I mentioned earlier, Death Mountain isn't truly a palace, but I wanted to give it an honorary mention here as it just sucks. You gotta go through all these caves which have no indication of where you'll come out, meaning you can absolutely go the wrong way and waste not only your time, but your very limited health and lives. There are exactly 0 health items, enemies don't drop hearts, and you may have the life spell at this point, but it's so expensive that you get exactly 1 use out of it before you need to get a magic refill. Death Mountain is also filled with these axe-wielding enemies called Daira that hit like a truck, swing fast, and have twice the reach you do. I don't know how to handle these guys properly, so I just end up throwing myself at them and trying really hard to jump away after an attack. Death Mountain isn't an optional area either. You need to get through it in order to get this magic jar that increases your magic gauge, and this hammer which is needed to clear these roadblocks. Death Mountain is an extremely low point in this game. I'm not even sure if having it be later would really make it better or not, but I think having it right after the first palace is just too much. Like Palace 1, Palace 2 doesn't really do anything to ramp up difficulty that much. Your main challenge comes from the enemies within. The only tricky things I can think of are trying to get this pea bag over more lava in this room right before the item room. This room drops blocks on your head, and you need to get through them quickly or suffer the consequences. The blocks fall randomly, and it is entirely possible to get stuck and simply have to wait out your death. That is, until you get the palace's item, which are the gauntlets. These gauntlets let you destroy certain blocks with your sword. Now this room isn't as big of an issue since getting stuck doesn't mean you're doomed. The boss here is Helmet Head. He's not any more fun than Horsehead, but I get a kick out of how smacking away his 2 helmets causes them to fly around and attack you. Slightly more challenging, but doesn't take much longer than the first boss. After the travesty that is Death Mountain and the relative breeze of Palace 2, things actually start to speed up along with the difficulty. Palace 3 still doesn't have a super complicated layout, but it throws blue iron knuckles at you, which are the hardest variant. They hit hard, have a ton more HP, but they also throw little daggers at you and they're relentless about it. The strategy doesn't change, but now you gotta approach faster because getting up to them without taking damage feels impossible. There is an enemy that is much more fearsome than the blue iron knuckle though. One so dangerous, so bothersome that it immediately sends me into a spiral of rage and anguish. These floating dog head things. These things are the absolute worst enemies in the whole game. Worse than the Daira, worse than the Iron Knuckles, and the absolute worst Experience Thief. All they do is fly around the screen. They move forward a bit, shoot a projectile, then change elevation and repeat. The problem comes from the location they get put in and their speed. They traverse the screen so slowly, but attack every time they stop to change elevation. The projectiles can be blocked, but you'll constantly be changing your stance to block them. They also come in pairs, so by the time you block one set of attacks, you need to get ready to block the next set. Combine this with the area you face them in, and it is super easy to get overwhelmed. In this particular room, you need to get this key, and doing so gets you into a pit that requires you to break out. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue, but the problem comes from having to do this and fight these beasts of war. To make things worse, on a personal matter, these enemies make me very impatient, which causes more problems. Taking contact damage from the head drains your experience. Thankfully, these are the least common experience thieves you'll run into. The item you get in this palace is the raft, which allows you to go to the next area in the game. Unlike the first game, this is its only use as there are no secret areas to be found using it. The palace's boss is a 2-parter. The first part is super easy, just do a downstab attack as this blue iron knuckle flies by on its magical floating horse that reminds me of these enemies from Sir, You Were Being Hunted. After you defeat the horse, it just turns into a regular fight with a blue guy, and comes with all the same difficulties. Palace 4 itself isn't too terrible, though there is quite the uptick in lava pits compared to previous dungeons and another doghead room. It's really the walk to the palace that's a chore. From here on out, getting a game over starts getting stupid. Known as the Maze Palace, you have to go through the maze each time you make your way over. It's not a tough maze, but there are quite a few encounter spaces that you have to get through. Thankfully, there are a few pits to worry about and it's all open air so you can just jump past most of the encounters. I would absolutely recommend going straight to the item if you can, the item being the water walking boots. These boots let you traverse certain water squares, and thankfully there are some right next to the palace itself, allowing you to skip 2/3 of the maze if you need to walk back. This palace's boss is a joke, and this time, I mean it's an absolute joke. Before you even get to the palace, you should have acquired the Reflect spell, which not only lets you block certain, but not all, projectiles, it lets you reflect the spells cast at you from Wizrobes, returning from the previous game but looking a bit more suspicious. The only way to hurt them is to reflect the spells back, but I often just don't cast the spell to save my mana since the shield will still block the spell and they vanish quickly afterwards. The boss is the Grand Wizard, and he fights just like a Wizrobe. There's no special trick to this, you don't have to have any fancy feat work or time attacks just right. All you need to do is cast Reflect and park yourself in a corner and watch as the boss just kills itself. Truly pathetic, but at least his sprite looks cool. Just another palace, except you need to walk along some water to get to it. You'll encounter these new wizards, and unlike Wizrobes, these guys are an actual threat. They appear and disappear all the same, but instead of casting a wave that can be deflected, they cast a fireball that crawls forward a bit. There is something about the distance and speed of this combined with the timing of their vanish that makes these guys awkward to fight. It probably has something to do with me just trying to power through the palaces, but I find them to be quite the nuisance. This palace does one thing that I find rather obnoxious: fake walls. Early on, you can come across this dead end with a blue iron knuckle and see this key beyond the wall. You can't get to it, but it's very clear that you'll need to get to the other side. In doing so, you'll come across an identical room, except this time the wall will extend all the way beyond where you can see. This is a trick. You have to jump through the wall to progress and get the key as well as the item. This is stupid. There is zero indication that you can jump through this wall. It's not like any of this is optional either. The item you get is the flute, which is required to not only clear the next roadblock, but reveal the next palace. Regardless, you get through the stupid wall, grab the key, and finally off to the boss. This boss suffers everything the previous one suffered from. You need to get awkwardly close to hit, have to jump out with an extremely tight window, and his attack has such a long reach and hits like a freight train. I like his little shuffle though. Pretty nimble for how bulky he is. Last palace before the final stretch of the game. The trek here is about as rough as the previous one. You have to deal with 3 encounter spaces going through this mountain passage. In these, Lizalfos will relentlessly pelt you with rocks as you pass by. At first, I struggled with this until I realized that they didn't target Link. They actually predict where you will be and target accordingly. Simply wiggling back and forth when they start throwing will give you plenty of openings to get through without taking damage. After that, you actually have a choice between going around this lake through some forests or the quick route through this bridge. This bridge sucks. It's filled with pits and these jumping skull enemies that are a part of the experienced thief group. Before going to the palace though, you'll want to go north to the secret village to get not only the spell, but also the skeleton key that lets you pass by any and all locked doors without the need to get a small key. Quick side note, this was also in the first game, but I had no idea it existed, and you really didn't need it. In order to reveal this palace, you need to play the flute in the middle of these rocks. This palace isn't quite as long as the previous, but its layout is a bit tricky. Firstly, on your way to the item, there's an invisible pit that drops you to the floor below. Thankfully, it doesn't mean death, but getting out of it is quite a pain. This jump right here can be done without use of the jump spell, but it's incredibly precise and almost feels like you weren't supposed to do it. What this does mean is that if you get up here without magic and can't perform the jump, you're likely out of luck and need to find a way to lose a life or reset the game. On your way to get the item, you'll actually encounter a mini-boss. Finally. Unfortunately, it's just a rehash of the Iron Knuckle on a horse. In fact, you'll fight him twice. The strategy is the exact same and the arena is still just an empty room. The item you get is the cross, which reveals some enemies in the next part of the game. This item is technically optional, but unless you want to have a needlessly tough time, I highly recommend getting it. There's another room in here that I used to think was really tough. In here, you've got to make jumps over instant death pits, all while dodging these floating dragon heads that can easily knock you into the pit. Trying to ferry over will get you stuck, since the other end is blocked by bricks and you can't uncast ferry without exiting the screen. What I have found out is if you take the time to defeat the heads as they fly across, they actually stay defeated unless you move backwards. This dungeon flicked on a much needed light bulb in my head that taking time in certain rooms would have probably benefited me greatly. Too little, too late, I suppose. The way into the boss is a bit obtuse as well, as it does require the use of the fairy spell. You need to fall from the room above and quickly cast it before you fall to the next screen and then just fly through. This was always a bit odd, mostly because afterwards there's an enemy which makes me think you're not supposed to ferry across, but I just don't see any other way to get in here. The boss itself, Barba, is the boss I was talking about when I said I liked fighting exactly one. Barba is a dragon that comes up out of these pits and shoots fire at you. In order to defeat it, you need to hit the head. Casting jump will give you the height, and you can also get a swing in as it goes back into the lava. Obviously, getting knocked into the pits really sucks, but the fire is simple enough to time that a well-placed jump will avoid the blast and can even let you nab another hit. While I have issues at times making the hit connect, I've never felt like I've unfairly run into the boss because of Link's short attack range. Just make sure you cast jump after entering the arena, as the new speed and arc of Link's jump can cause you to hit the corner and fall straight into the pit. Admittedly, I thought this was pretty funny since it was no one's fault but my own. With all 6 stones in place, Link can finally enter the Great Palace. But before you get there, you need to traverse the Valley of Death. Before even that, you need to make sure you get the Thunder Spell from this town, as it is 1000% required to beat the game. The Valley of Death is this game's greatest challenge, even harder than the Great Palace itself. Especially because, like everything else, game over here means you start all the way back at the beginning and need to make your way back through every single encounter space and whatever random encounters you come across. Each encounter puts you into a cave which comes with some of the worst pits and these floating enemies that are relentless. Falling into a pit feels mandatory. It will happen and you probably will die a lot. That is, if you're like me and forget that the spell turns most enemies into blobs. I wish I had remembered this. Certainly wish I had in my previous playthrough, because it is night and day how easy this gets when you're not being harassed by these flying monsters. Just make sure to also cast jump on these final pits here. It's possible to make it without, but the jump itself is super tight. But here we are, finally to the Great Palace. If you manage to get here without placing all 6 stones, this barrier will instantly kill you. But with all stones in place, it will rise and let us enter our final challenge. This palace is huge, spanning over 50 rooms in total. What's worse is there are several dead ends, and until you get there, you won't realize you've been played like a fiddle, since the layout is identical to the actual pathway. There are no items in here though, so assuming you grab the skeleton key, you are free to head straight to the boss room. Easier said than done, however, as you will be going against the toughest enemies this game has to offer. Firstly, you've got these fire-breathing bird enemies that drop little fireballs everywhere and constantly bounce back and forth. These aren't too bad and are pretty easy to dodge as well. What isn't so easy to dodge are these bird knight things. Think Iron Knuckle, but instead of simply walking at you, these guys also jump around like madmen. They hit hard and will adjust their shield to block you. Like any enemy, my strategy is just throw myself at them and jump and stab. The blue ones will also throw daggers at you, and just trying to get around them isn't the best idea since they move too fast and are very unlikely to let you get away enough to off-screen them. Get past these, the secret hole in the floor, and this not-so-secret hole, and you're on your way to fight the first of a 2-part boss fight, the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird is the hardest boss in the game. In order to even start damaging him, you need to cast the Thunder spell. This spell takes about half your magic, and you're also going to want to cast Shield and Jump. What this basically means is you need to do this fight without healing since you won't have enough magic left over for even one cast. His form of attack is to throw fireballs down onto you just like the other Firebird thing. But as you deal more damage, the fireballs get more numerous and faster. Patience is key here. There will always be an opening where you can jump up and get a hit in. Watch the fireballs, don't worry so much about the boss itself. Defeating it lets you move on to the true final boss, Shadow Link. Finally, Link's ultimate trial, where he must overcome himself in order to retrieve the Triforce of Courage. How does he overcome such an obstacle? Stand in the corner and stab his knees. Sure, it's cheesing the penultimate fight, but at this point in the game, I'm just tired and ready to see the end screen. It is absolutely possible to beat him without doing this, but having to do it right after the Thunderbird and without healing is a challenge I'm just not interested in. I'm going to combine my thoughts on both the visual aspects and sound design into one segment since neither will take too much time. Visually, it's an NES game. It is a major step up from the previous title both with the overworld and dungeon design. The overworld's overhaul, it makes areas distinct from one another, and the side-scrolling approach to the palaces, towns, and combat give a more interesting perspective that lets in more visual detail, primarily with the character sprites. Sound has also seen a heavy facelift, especially with the game's soundtrack. It's still a bit repetitive, but I find it to be overall better than the original. The overworld theme is just as catchy, and the palace theme is one of my favorites in the series, even if that's mostly due to the reorchestrated versions that float around out in the wild. Special shout out to Super Smash Bros. Melee's rendition. Bosses even have their own theme for the first time, making them feel more climactic than the previous game. It is still an NES title though, so it's not like we've got cutting edge detail and everything still looks flat. It may look better than the first game, but it is still way down there in terms of aesthetic. This game is very different when compared to the previous game. It took a winning overhead exploration game and turned it into a 2D side-scrolling action-adventure title. It greatly expands the world of Hyrule and fills it with life by having not only towns, but real people within them, even if they aren't always exactly useful. We've gone from upgrading your strength via items to a traditional leveling system that, when coupled with the life mechanics, can be rather gruesome. It feels like it's different for the sake of being different, which is pretty on brand for Nintendo. Do I like it though? Short answer, no. It's punishing for the sake of being punishing, and I don't care for that. That doesn't mean it's without salvation though. A diamond in the rough. In this era of remakes and remasters, this is the kind of game I'd like to see get this treatment the most. Aside from benefiting from an audio-visual facelift, there are several things that could be remedied to make this game go from overly punishing to a fun challenge without compromising the difficulty fans really love. Firstly, Link needs more combat options. Notice how I didn't go over the spells all that much? That's because beyond the few required segments, I didn't really use any of them except for shield and life. Make the spells less situational, such as letting you go in and out of fairy at will. Give Link more weapons. At the very least, give me a sword upgrade that gives him some extra reach. So many issues would be solved if I didn't have to make out with all the enemies to get in reliable hits. Bring back traditional items. I would have loved for a long-range options like the bow or the boomerang, which would even open up more options for dungeon complexity. The life system needs to go. This adds nothing to the game. It doesn't make it more fun or even more tense, it just makes me want to put it down when I get a game over at the later palaces. If for some reason it is determined an integral part to the game's core design, then just make it so when you game over you either respawn at the palace you're in or at the last town you visited. Either change the experience lost on death or remove it entirely. I don't inherently dislike the idea of having traditional leveling in a Zelda game, but losing everything after a game over is needless, and just like warping back to the start of the game, adds nothing. The reason this works in other games like Dark Souls is because you can still retrieve your lost experience should you make it back without dying. Personally, I'd prefer getting stronger through gear like the previous game, but if the experience had to stay, at least don't make me lose all of it upon a game over. I do not enjoy playing Zelda 2 on the NES because it just frustrates me, and the satisfaction of overcoming the tough parts is not enough to get me through it. It's even worse since I don't think it has to be this way. It could be way less punishing without losing too much challenge. Just like the first game, I don't believe you miss anything by skipping out on this one. If you're up for the challenge, it's super easy to get a hold of and play it. Don't let my negativity deter you. There are plenty of people out there who enjoy this game and think it's just fun the way it is. That's the beautiful thing about opinions. You're allowed to be wrong, but all opinions are to be respected regardless of which camp you're in. This has been another episode of the Opinionative Show. Thank you for watching and have a fantastic rest of your day.